A breakup is supposed to be an ending. One person decides the relationship is over, the two go their separate ways, and life continues. For most people, that is exactly how it works. But for a small number of people, the moment a partner says it is over becomes the most dangerous moment of their lives. The cases that follow are not crimes of sudden passion. They are slower than that and colder. They involve research and planning. Acid bought weeks in advance, burner phones, staged fires, fake identities, and in 2 instances they exposed gaps in the law so serious that the law itself had to change. Each victim had simply tried to leave. Here are 5 of the most disturbing deaths caused by breakups. It was September 23, 2015, in Bristol, England. Mark Van Dongen was a 25-year-old Dutch engineer asleep in the flat of his former girlfriend, Berlina Wallace, a fashion student. The two had been together for around 5 years, a relationship in which he had provided her with emotional and financial support. He had recently ended it and begun seeing another woman. Wallace had not accepted that the relationship was over. What she did next was not a sudden loss of control. 3 weeks earlier, on September 2nd, she had bought a 1-liter container of sulfuric acid at 98% concentration, an industrial chemical strong enough to dissolve tissue on contact. She removed the label. On her computer, investigators would later find 82 separate entries documenting her research into sulfuric acid, the injuries it caused, and what happened to the people it was thrown upon. That night, she lured Mark to her flat. He fell asleep there, and as he slept she threw the acid over him. He woke into a kind of agony that is difficult to describe, the chemical already eating through skin and muscle, and he ran. He made it out into the street, burning, and a neighbor found him crouched on the pavement, tearing at his own clothes, calling out that he could not see. People who came to help could not touch him without burning themselves. By the time the emergency services reached him, the damage was catastrophic, and it would only deepen in the days that followed as the acid continued its work beneath the surface. Mark survived the attack, but only in the most limited sense of the word. Around a quarter of his body was burned, a figure that climbed toward 40% after the skin graft surgeries that followed. He lost the sight in his left eye. He lost an ear. His left leg had to be amputated because the acid had destroyed the blood supply to it. He was left paralyzed from the neck down. He spent close to a year in an intensive care unit, conscious, in constant pain, unable to move and barely able to communicate. Before the attack, Mark had been an active man, an engineer for whom physical capability was simply part of who he was. Wallace had taken nearly all of it. He could not walk, could not see properly, could not feed or wash himself, and could not escape the pain that came with every hour. He communicated his wishes to his father, who became his advocate through the long months in hospital. After 15 months of that, Mark made a decision. He was a Dutch citizen, and in Belgium, where he was being cared for and where his father could be with him, euthanasia is legal under strict medical and psychological assessment. The decision is not granted lightly. Doctors and specialists had to be satisfied that his suffering was constant, unbearable, and without any prospect of relief. They were. In January 2017, 15 months after Berlina Wallace threw acid over him as he slept, Mark Van Dongen ended his life through legal euthanasia. He was 29 years old. The attack had not killed him outright. It had simply made living impossible. Throughout the investigation and trial, Wallace maintained that Mark had poured the acid into a glass himself, intending that she should drink it, and that the burns were somehow his own doing. The jury rejected that account. Her trial took place at Bristol Crown Court in 2018. The prosecution charged her with murder, arguing that the chain of events she set in motion led directly to Mark's death more than a year later. The legal question was difficult because of the time that had passed, and because Mark's own choice of euthanasia stood between the attack and the death. The jury cleared Wallace of murder. They also cleared her of the alternative charge of manslaughter, but they convicted her of throwing a corrosive substance with intent to do grievous bodily harm. The judge described the case as one of exceptional gravity and sentenced Wallace to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 12 years before she could be considered for parole. Mark's family, who had watched him endure 15 months of agony before he chose to die, objected to the murder acquittal. To them, the verdict failed to name what had actually happened. A woman had bought acid, researched it, delabeled it, and poured it over a sleeping man because he had left her, and the word murder had not been allowed to stick. It was October 15th, 2009, in Palo Alto, California. In a small cottage on Addison Avenue, 29-year-old Jennifer Schipsi was strangled and her body set on fire. The man who did it was her boyfriend, Bulos Zumot, known to most people as Paul, the owner of a local hookah bar. Their relationship had lasted roughly 2 years, and it had been volatile for most of that time. Jennifer had told friends, family, and police on more than one occasion that Zumot had threatened to kill her. These were not vague fears confided to a diary. They were statements made out loud to multiple people, including law enforcement, in the months before her death. People around her knew she was frightened of him. Jennifer was a young woman with a life and a future ahead of her. The relationship with Zumot had become a trap, the kind that is obvious to the people watching from outside and far harder to escape from within. She had reached out for help, told the authorities what was happening, and made sure that the people closest to her understood the danger she felt she was in. That she did all of this and was still killed is part of what makes the case so haunting. The warnings were not missed. They were on the record. By the autumn of 2009, Jennifer had decided to leave. She told Zumot the relationship was over and that she intended to report him to the police. For a man who had reportedly threatened her life, that combination, abandonment and exposure, was the trigger. He was about to lose her and to be exposed at the same time, and rather than accept either, he chose to make sure she could never do either again. On October 15th, inside the cottage they shared, Zumot strangled her. Then, he attempted to erase what he had done. He poured gasoline over her body and set the home on fire, an effort to disguise the killing as an accidental blaze and destroy the evidence along with it. The fire did not conceal the truth. Investigators determined that Jennifer had been dead before the fire started, and the arson, far from hiding the murder, became one of the most damning elements of the case against him. Prosecutors built their case around the timeline, the physical evidence in the cottage, and the long record of Jennifer's stated fears. They argued that Zumot had killed her in the home they shared and then tried to burn the truth away. In 2011, a jury convicted Bulos Zumot of first-degree murder and arson. He was sentenced to a term of 33 years to life in prison, and for most observers the case was closed. It was not. In 2020, a federal district court judge reviewed the conviction and granted Zumot a new trial, setting aside the original verdict and forcing the entire case to be heard again more than a decade after the crime. Prosecutors had to reassemble evidence from 2009 and present it to a fresh jury, while Zumot's defense hoped that new material would support his alibi for the day Jennifer died. The retrial began in 2025. Zumot, now years older, sat through the evidence a second time. On October 15, 2025, exactly 16 years to the day after Jennifer Schipsi was killed, the second jury reached the same conclusion as the first. They found him guilty of murder and arson again. In November 2025, he was sentenced to 30 years in prison, a term made up of 25 years for the first-degree murder and an additional 5 years for the arson. Two separate juries, 16 years apart, had looked at the same facts and arrived at the same verdict. Jennifer had told everyone who would listen that the man she was trying to leave had threatened to kill her. She had been right, and it had taken the justice system the better part of 2 decades to finish saying so. It was February 2nd, 2009, in Salford, in Greater Manchester, England. Clare Wood was 36 years old, a mother, found strangled and burned in her own home. The man responsible was George Appleton, a person she had met online and dated for a matter of months, and a person she knew almost nothing about. They had met through Facebook. The relationship moved quickly, and it soured just as fast. By October 2008, Clare had ended it, driven away by his controlling, coercive behavior and his infidelity. Appleton refused to accept the breakup. What followed was a campaign of harassment that escalated over months. He damaged her property, he threatened to kill her, and at one point he attempted to rape her. Clare did not suffer this in silence. She filed multiple reports with the police. She told them what he was doing. She asked, in effect, to be protected. What Clare did not know was that the man frightening her was not a stranger to the police at all. George Appleton had a long and documented history of violence against women, a record that the authorities were aware of. Clare had no way of seeing that history. There was no mechanism that allowed an ordinary person, frightened of a new partner, to ask the police whether that partner had hurt women before. The information existed. It simply was not shared with the one person whose life depended on it. Clare was not a passive victim. She was a working mother trying to extract herself from a man who would not let go, and she used the tools available to her. She went to the police repeatedly and documented what was happening. By the standards of what any reasonable person could do, she did the right things. The system she turned to held the very information that might have changed everything, and it stayed locked inside police files while the threat against her grew. On February 2, 2009, Appleton strangled Clare Wood in her home and set her body on fire. He then fled. 6 days later, he was found hanged in a derelict building. He had taken his own life, and with him went any prospect of a trial, a conviction, or an explanation given under oath. There would be no one in a dock to answer for what had happened in that house in Salford. The man who killed Clare had removed himself from the reach of justice entirely. For most murders, the story would end there, with a dead victim and a dead perpetrator, and no one left to hold accountable. Clare's father, Michael Brown, refused to let it end there. He learned what the police had known about Appleton, and he became convinced that if his daughter had been told, she might have made different choices, and she might have lived. He campaigned for years for a change in the law. The argument was simple and powerful. People entering relationships should have the right to ask the police whether a new partner had a history of domestic violence, and the police should have a clear framework for telling them. He took that argument to the press, to politicians, and to anyone who would listen, refusing to let his daughter's death be filed away as a private tragedy with no public consequence. That campaign produced what became known as Clare's Law, formerly the Domestic Violence Disclosure Scheme, named after the woman whose death exposed the gap. It created two routes. The first is a right to ask, under which a person who is worried can request information from the police about a current or former partner. The second is a right to know, under which the police can proactively disclose information to someone they believe may be at risk, even if that person has not asked. After being piloted in several police force areas, the scheme was rolled out across the whole of England and Wales in 2014, and similar schemes followed elsewhere. It exists because Michael Brown decided that what the police knew about George Appleton should never again be withheld from the woman whose life depended on knowing it. Clare Wood was killed because she ended a relationship with a violent man whose violence had been invisible to her. The law that carries her name exists so that the next person in her position can see what she could not. It cannot undo what happened in that house in Salford. It was built so that the same blindness would not cost another life in the same way. It was July 25, 2010, in the staff car park of Blackpool Victoria Hospital in Lancashire, England. Jane Clough, a 26-year-old nurse, was arriving for a shift when she was ambushed and stabbed 71 times. The man waiting for her was Jonathan Vass, a bodybuilder, her former partner, and the father of her baby daughter. Their relationship had ended, and in its aftermath, Jane had made a series of grave accusations against him. She alleged that he had raped her repeatedly and assaulted her during the time they were together. These were serious charges, and they were taken seriously enough that Vass was arrested and charged. He was awaiting trial for those offenses when he killed her. The detail that turned this case into a national scandal was what happened between his arrest and Jane's death. Despite the nature of the allegations, a judge granted Jonathan Vass bail, releasing him back into the community while he awaited trial for raping the mother of his child. Jane was terrified. She believed he would come for her, and she said so. She kept a diary in which she recorded her fear, and in its pages she predicted, in plain terms, that Vass would kill her. Jane was, by every account, a devoted nurse and a young mother building a life around her infant daughter. She had reported a man she said had raped and assaulted her, and instead of being kept safe while the case proceeded, she found herself living in the shadow of the very man she had accused, walking into work each day knowing he was free. Her diary captured that dread in her own words. She wrote about her fear, and she set down, in unmistakable terms, her belief that Jonathan Vass was going to kill her. It reads now like a warning that no one with the power to act ever managed to act upon. She was right. On the morning of July 25, 2010, Vass lay in wait in the staff car park where he knew she would arrive for work. As she came to begin her shift at the hospital, the place where she cared for other people, he attacked her. He stabbed her 71 times. The sheer number speaks to the rage behind it. A killing carried out not in a single moment of violence, but in a sustained, frenzied assault that continued long past the point of any possible survival. It was not a panic. It was an act of revenge against a woman who had left him and then dared to accuse him. Jonathan Vass pleaded guilty to murder. On October 14, 2010, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. Because he had admitted the murder, he never stood trial for the rape allegations Jane had made, and so those charges were never tested in court, a fact that compounded her family's grief. Jane's parents, John and Penny Clough, did what Clare Wood's father had done a year earlier, and in the same country. They refused to accept that the system that had freed Vass on bail could simply move on. Their daughter had been killed by a man a court had chosen to release while he awaited a rape trial, and they wanted to make sure that decision could never go unchallenged again. Their campaign produced what became known as Jane's Law. Before it, when a Crown Court judge granted bail to a defendant, the prosecution had no right to appeal that decision. The judge's word was final. The defendant walked free, and even if the prosecution believed the person was dangerous, there was nothing further they could do. Jane's Law, which came into effect in 2012, changed that. It gave prosecutors the right to appeal a Crown Court decision to grant bail, so that a defendant released over the objections of the prosecution could be challenged at a higher level before any harm was done. It is a narrow change in procedure, but the human stakes behind it are anything but technical. Jane Clough had written in her diary that the man on bail would kill her, and he did. The law that bears her name exists to give prosecutors the second chance that Jane never got, a chance to keep the next defendant like Vass behind bars until his trial. It was December 14, 2023, in Broomfield, Colorado. Crystal Krug, 43, was attacked from behind in her own suburban home, knocked unconscious, and stabbed in the heart. The man who killed her was her husband, Daniel Krug, a 44-year-old IT professional, and the way he went about it is what sets this case apart from almost any other. The Krug marriage was falling apart, but Daniel did not want a divorce, and he did not simply lash out. Instead, over a period of roughly 2 to 4 months, he constructed an elaborate fiction designed to manipulate his own wife. He invented a stalker. Using burner phones, fake email accounts, and false online identities, Daniel began terrorizing Crystal as though he were a dangerous stranger. He sent her vulgar and threatening messages. He made claims of surveillance, suggesting she was being watched. He posted explicit advertisements. He worked to frame a real person, an ex-boyfriend of Crystal's who lived in Utah, so that the imaginary stalker would appear to have a face and a name. To Crystal, the threat was real and growing. She came to fear for herself and for her family, not knowing that the man sending the messages was the man sleeping beside her. The campaign was not a single message or a brief impulse. It was sustained over weeks and months, a parallel reality that Daniel maintained alongside his ordinary life as a husband and father. He would go to work, raise his children, and live in the house with his wife, and at the same time he would be the anonymous menace filling her phone with threats and feeding her fear. The amount of effort involved is part of what makes the case so chilling. This was not rage, it was project management. The purpose of the scheme, prosecutors said, was as disturbing as the scheme itself. Daniel intended to play the rescuer. He would let the terror build, then position himself as the one who protected her from it, and in doing so win her back as the marriage collapsed. He He was the puppet master pulling both strings, the threat and the salvation, manufacturing a crisis so that he could be the solution to it. A marriage that was ending would, in his version of events, be saved by his heroism against a danger only he knew was fictional. On the morning of December 14th, 2023, the pretense ended. Daniel had taken 2 of the couple's children to school. He used Crystal's own phone to disable the home security system at 8:15 in the morning, and he covered the family's doorbell camera with blue masking tape taken from a kitchen drawer. Then he waited for her to come home, attacked her from behind, knocked her unconscious, and stabbed her in the heart. The evidence that undid him was the same machinery he had used to torment her. The burner phones had been purchased with a Visa gift card registered to Daniel himself. One of those phones repeatedly turned up in the same locations as his personal phone, placing the stalker and the husband in exactly the same places at exactly the same times. The fake stalker had left a trail that led directly back to the man who invented him. Investigators reconstructed the digital paper trail and laid it alongside the physical evidence from the morning of the murder: the disabled alarm, the taped-over camera, the timing of his movements. What emerged was a portrait of a man who had spent months building a lie, and a single morning carrying out the act it had always been leading toward. In 2025, after a multi-week trial, a jury convicted Daniel Krug of first-degree murder, along with stalking and criminal impersonation, the charges that captured the months of psychological torture he had inflicted under a false name. The stalking and impersonation counts mattered because they named the cruelty of the scheme itself, not just the killing that ended it. The murder conviction in Colorado carried a mandatory sentence. The day after the verdict, Daniel Krug was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Crystal Krug spent the final months of her life frightened of a stalker who did not exist, comforted by a husband who was the stalker. She died believing in a threat he had built specifically so that she would turn to him. The breakup he refused to allow ended not with reconciliation, but with a knife, a taped-over camera, and a fiction so complete that she never knew the danger was already inside the house.